All right, everyone hear me? Excellent. First, thank you, Ben, for that introduction. I just want to say I really appreciate you all having me here today. I have been very honored and privileged to work with this trustee group for over the last 15 years. So it is very satisfying to be able to stand up here today and share with you the process that we went through and the results. Okay, so I am just going to walk through a few general concepts. One is a site overview. Second is an overview of the natural resource damage assessment process. I'm going to talk about restoration projects and alternatives, and finally the public process. And I'm realizing that I was expecting to have some option for seeing my slides, so I don't have to keep turning around. Is that an option? All right. Okay, this way I do not have to keep turning my back to you to talk. Oh. Can I have it on this side? Is there Sweet. Look at that technology right there. Okay. All right. So, I'm sure everybody is familiar with Oak Ridge Reservation. It's why we're here. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, the reservation currently has just over 32,000 acres. We know that amount of acreage has changed over time, but that's where it sits currently. It's located in Oak Ridge, and it is adjacent to the Clinch River. And as we know, it is owned by the U.S. Department of Energy. Because the area is so large, it is able to support a diverse variety of habitats. It includes grasslands, creeks, rivers, some wetlands and floodplains, and all of those habitats support a wide variety of fish and wildlife. So everything from invertebrates, which are worms, those are prey, food for larger organisms, so fish, birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, etc. There are 3 facilities that U.S. Department of Energy constructed within the Oak Ridge Reservation boundaries. Oak Ridge National Lab. I didn't change the slide, I just changed it on mine. Okay. I'm hoping with the powers of my mind that it will all happen. You can see a picture of Y12 in the corner, and also East Tennessee Technology Park, ETTP as it's often referred to. The purpose of these facilities was to conduct research, development, and implement processes to support the Manhattan Project, which was the research and development of nuclear weapons, and that included uranium enrichment. Operations at the facilities, though, did release waste into the environment, and that waste was contaminated with substances such as PCBs, which are polychlorinated biphenyls. They are an organic but synthetic compound, various metals, and radionuclides. All right. Current activities at the site that are relevant to this discussion include processing nuclear materials and activities related to both energy and national defense programs. I could tell you more, but I'm actually not allowed to say. Cleanup actions are ongoing. That includes demolition of contaminated buildings, construction of contaminant treatment facilities such as mercury, and also excavation of contaminated media. So that could be sediment, it could be soil. These are just, by the way, I know we could probably spend an entire 2 hours and then some just talking about the history of Oak Ridge, but I am giving you very small snippets to set the stage so that we can talk about the restoration, which is the focus of this presentation. So why are we here? It's because we are conducting a natural resource damage assessment. Contamination released from the Oak Ridge Reservation has negatively impacted natural resources and resource services. So resources are not people, just to be clear. While we are part of the natural environment sometimes, we are not natural resources as defined by the regulations, which means we are not focused on human health per se. We are focused on the resources that use habitats. So that is fish, wildlife, but also the physical components of a habitat like surface water, soil, and sediment. And then the services that those resources and habitats can provide. And those services can be ecological processes like nutrient cycling, and they can also be the human uses of those resources like recreation and drinking water. So the goal of the damage assessment process is to restore natural resources and their associated services equivalent to what was lost as a result of the contamination. Okay, so under CERCLA, CERCLA is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. No one ever says that whole thing. We all say CERCLA, or sometimes it is referred to as the Superfund Act. Natural resource damage assessments are conducted by government officials who, under those regulations, are designated as trustees of natural resources for the public to bring claims when those resources are adversely impacted, specifically as a result of contamination. So there are many ways in which the environment can be adversely impacted. This process specifically focuses on hazardous substances. As Ben introduced at the beginning, the trustees for the Oak Ridge Reservation Natural Resource Damage Assessment, or NRDA, are the State of Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the U.S. Department of Energy, and the U.S. Department of Interior as represented by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There are a lot of activities, as I mentioned, currently ongoing at the reservation, many of which involve remediation, so cleanup of contaminated areas. That process is very important, and it is related to, but not the same as, the damage assessment process. These two processes, NRDA and remedy, have, as I said, related but different goals. So damage assessment is to restore natural resources to their baseline condition. And baseline in this case is, what would the environment have looked like except for contamination? So we know there would be infrastructure, we know that there might be climate change, all of those things are still accounted for, but what would it look like except for the contamination? And we look at impacts to resources from the time when that injury first occurred all the way up through today, and then any potential subsequent injuries from that contamination into the future. In contrast, remedy's goal is to reduce or eliminate present and future threats to human health or the environment as a result of exposure to hazardous substances. So it may not actually eliminate what we define as injury in the NRDA process, because typically remedy does not remove every single particle of contamination from the system. There is often some residual, and the damage assessment process is designed to account for that. I think of it this way. If you get into a car accident and you have to send your car to the mechanic, 3 months later, your mechanic might send you your car back and say, look at that, good as new. That's remedy. Fixing your car is the remedy. But for the 3 months your car was in the shop, how did you get around? Maybe you had to take the bus. Maybe you had to walk. You incurred some cost to yourself. And so NRDA, our goal is to try and compensate the public for whatever that cost was. Okay, so specifically now taking that damage assessment process and applying it to Oak Ridge Reservation, in 1993, on a dark and stormy night, that's how all my stories start to my kids, a trustee council was formed to specifically look at the type and scope of natural resource injury and service loss resulting from contaminant releases at Oak Ridge. And the trustee council acknowledged at that time that looking at the spatial and temporal extent of potential injuries resulting from the release of contaminants from Oak Ridge was so extensive that it made sense to divide the process into two parts. So phase one was to look at impacts to resources in Watts Bar Reservoir. And the geographic extent of that assessment is from Watts Bar, it's in the Clinch River, from the Tennessee River arm upstream to the Fort Loudon Dam, and then downstream to the Watts Bar Dam. We looked at ecological and recreational fishing losses, and in 2009, the state of Tennessee and the Department of Energy signed an agreement that compensated for both of those categories of loss for the ecological and recreational impacts associated with contamination. And that agreement included conservation of the BORS, the Black Oak Ridge Conservation Easement. It's approximately 3,000 acres. It provides ecological services, groundwater recharge, recreational opportunities, and in addition, because recreational fishing was a component that was substantially impacted by contamination, the Department of Energy, as part of that agreement, also provided funding specifically to implement recreational fishing actions or restoration opportunities. So phase 2 is the rest of the area that was potentially impacted by Oak Ridge contaminant releases. So we're just calling it, for purposes of this presentation, that's the ORR part of the NRDA as opposed to the Watts Bar portion. So we're focused on a few components. One is the terrestrial habitat within the Oak Ridge Reservation. That is, terrestrial is another word for upland. Floodplain and aquatic habitat for a portion of the Clinch River, upstream of where the Watts Bar assessment began, so we don't have any spatial gaps. Floodplain and aquatic habitat of several of the tributaries that flow adjacent to or through Oak Ridge Reservation property into the Clinch. And then we also wanted to make sure that we assessed groundwater, which is both underlying and flowing out under from, that was a lot of prepositions in a row, from the Oak Ridge Reservation. So what's a natural resource injury? So as I mentioned, it's not to people, it's to biological resources, plants, animals, water, sediment. And an injury is a decrease in that resource's ability to provide services due to contamination. So I'm going to list some examples from the regulations. These are the definitions of injury. Decreased survival, reproductive impairment, physical deformities. That is one type of injury that can be incurred. Another type is the existence of a consumption advisory. So oftentimes, agencies will determine that because of contaminant levels in a particular resource, like fish or crabs or mussels, something that people consume, those levels are too high for humans to consume in an unlimited way, and so a consumption advisory is imposed. And then the third type of injury is an exceedance of a regulatory criteria. For example, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency publishes ambient water quality criteria, which are levels above which contaminant concentrations may be harmful to aquatic fish and invertebrates that may be exposed to those concentrations. So if you have a level of contamination in your water body that exceeds that criteria, by definition, you have an injured resource. So for this particular site, the trustees used a few different types of information in order to inform the damage assessment. One is contaminant concentration data, and those data are measured concentrations that were collected on site. Site-specific and literature-based toxicological study results. So that means in some cases there is a study that went out and collected soil or sediment or water from the Oak Ridge Reservation and exposed organisms to it to try and understand what adverse effects those organisms had to suffer. And there is a whole body of peer-reviewed literature that exists wherein studies report the effects of contaminant exposure on various organisms. So we use that body of information. We looked at the history of consumption advisories that are relevant to all of the water bodies I just mentioned, and the water quality criteria. So this is a very simplified summary of the results of all of that analysis. This is like 10 years right here, so like squeezed into one slide. But I want to make a couple of points. One is that there are dozens of contaminants and hazardous substances that have been detected in resources at Oak Ridge Reservation. There are hundreds of species that exist on Oak Ridge Reservation, but it does not make sense, and the trustees are explicitly directed to, in the regulations, be cost-effective and reasonable in their assessment of resources. So this particular effort identified a subset of contaminants and a subset of resources that the group felt would accurately represent what was going on the reservation as a whole. So cadmium, chromium, and mercury, those are 3 metals. PCBs are the organic synthetic compound I mentioned, and radionuclides, which encompasses a whole group of radioactive isotopes. And then you can see going down on the left, there's sediment, fish, piscivorous birds, and piscivorous mammals. Piscivorous means fish eating. So because we're looking at aquatic habitats, we are looking at animals that get their contamination from resources in the rivers and the tributaries. A red check mark means that we identified contaminant concentrations that are above an injury threshold. So that could be above a regulatory criteria or above a literature information that indicated that an adverse effect likely had occurred. A green means below the injury threshold, and NA means not assessed. Not assessed, for example, radionuclides and piscivorous birds, there just is not enough information available for us to be able to understand what the current exposure of radionuclides, the current exposure of piscivorous birds to radionuclides actually means to those birds. We undertook the same exercise for the terrestrial resources, so the same 5 contaminants, and then the resources are soil, songbirds, and small mammals. And again, the check marks mean above injury threshold, the green is below the injury threshold, and NA means not assessed. So one important thing to remember is that we look at injury holistically, and in the event that there is a resource that is injured by mercury, but in this case, for example, not injured by cadmium, we still consider that resource injured. It's not as though it's, oh, well, three contaminants weren't injurious and only 2 were, so on balance, it's not injured. It doesn't work that way. This is any one particular contaminant, any single contaminant can trigger the injury. Okay, so what do we do with that information? Now we know that we have resources that have been exposed at levels that are considered injurious. So the first thing is to identify what those injuries actually mean in terms of the resources themselves. So we looked at injuries on a habitat basis, and again, this is to make sure that we are conducting this effort in a cost-effective but still reasonable and accurate way, because, like you'll notice, I didn't have reptiles and amphibians up on my list, but we know that they're exposed, we know that they're sensitive indicators. So we think about injury to resources, but within a given habitat. So that way, we can think about injury on a spatial scale that accounts for everything that would use that habitat. That also enables us to think about restoration on a habitat basis. So for example, if we said, okay, well, birds are injured, so we're just gonna put a bunch of birds back, that doesn't necessarily that doesn't ensure that we have accounted for everything that might have been impacted. So if we have a bird in a wetland habitat, we know that we want to replace that or restore a wetland habitat. So that's how we deal with ecological losses. On the groundwater side, groundwater is the resource, and we know that contamination in groundwater has originated from the Oak Ridge and has in the past and also continues to exceed regulatory criteria. And that means that the public cannot use that groundwater. So by definition, under the regulations, the public has now experienced a loss in groundwater services. On the recreational side, and again, remember, we're focused just on the geographic extent that I described, so within the Oak Ridge Reservation boundaries and then the Clinch and the tributaries, but there are a whole suite of recreational activities that we understand that the public can or has been engaged in. Fishing and hunting, bird watching, biking, boating, I mean, these are just some examples. We specifically looked at losses to recreational fishing and hunting, and similar to the eco side, there's enough information. There's a standard set of methods to evaluate changes to hunting and fishing, and we anticipate that by developing restoration options to benefit the public for those activities, we are also able to supplement that with restoration that will assist in benefiting these other activities as well. Okay, so one other point I want to make about recreational fishing in particular, as I mentioned, there are consumption advisories. They have been at least since 1990 and are still present on multiple water bodies within and around the Oak Ridge Reservation. I don't have a laser pointer, but if I may, sort of slightly north of my finger, you can see the orangish outline of the Oak Ridge Reservation, and then the various water body colors are simply designated based on how the advisories are assigned. When there is a fishing consumption advisory, the public tends to experience a few different types of loss. One is, I might go fishing, but I might not like it as much because I can't keep my catch, or I'm worried that if I keep it, maybe there's some contamination in the fish. The other thing I might do is decide not to go at all. Or I might decide to go somewhere else that costs me more to get to, or I might not like as much. So there are a few different ways that the public can be impacted when there's a consumption advisory on a particular water body. Hunting is similar in that if the public cannot hunt in a way that they expect, then they might incur some loss associated with that restriction. So in this case, the public can hunt deer and turkey on Oak Ridge Reservation. I know that there's a lottery system, a quota system. But anything that you harvest on the reservation needs to then be taken to a check station and tested for radiological contamination, which means you might not get to take it home. So in that case, now you've done all this work and you had to leave whatever you have managed to hunt behind. So you have now lost some value associated with participating in the hunting activity. Okay, so we know that resources have been exposed to contamination. We know that there have been ecological impacts, recreational impacts, groundwater impacts. What do we do about that? There was a lot of conversation between the entire trustee group with all of the supporting information, and the group was able to reach an agreement that $42 million to specifically put towards restoration of natural resources is sufficient to compensate for losses. And that the phrase I just used is very, very important. That $42 million is specifically required by the regulations to be spent on restoration projects. So while I imagine that there are many ideas and projects that the public could identify as things that you would love to see, those ideas need to be targeted for these funds specifically towards restoration of natural resources and a reconnection of the public to those resources. That $42 million is coming from two different sources. Approximately 50% is going to be funded through the repurposing of a perpetual care fund for the environmental management waste. That's a lot of management facility, which is the existing CERCLA landfill at the Oak Ridge Reservation. And I do want to point out that while this money is being transferred to for the purpose of funding damage assessment, the Department of Energy still retains and is required to undertake all of the management and maintenance associated with this landfill. So it's not as if this money is like the landfill is left in limbo. It's simply Department of Energy is going to pay for those actions from another pot, and the $24 million will go towards the NRDA settlement. And then the rest of the $42 million will be paid by the Department of Energy over a period not to exceed 7 years. The trustees as a group will oversee use of that settlement amount to select and fund projects that are described in the draft RCDPEA, which is the Restoration Compensation Determination Plan, and EA is Environmental Assessment. I'm going to explain what that means in a little bit more detail. So under federal regulations, the trustees need to come up with a plan for how they're going to spend this settlement money. And that plan has to satisfy a whole suite of criteria. So one of those criteria is to identify a few options for evaluation in order to select one, and that one is how you're going to implement restoration. The first alternative is no action, which means don't do anything, which is nice. I didn't have to write a whole lot of text in the document explaining what that meant. It means that All of the remedial actions and everything that's already going on still happens because that's not part of the NRDA process, but nothing else that's specifically damage assessment related will occur. So no restoration actions. And any contamination that remains after the remedy will just be addressed through natural recovery. There will be no additional actions. The second option is contaminant cleanup. Contaminant cleanup under NRD is in addition to anything that is required under any other remedial scenario. So that means anything beyond the remedial requirements. The examples of the types of actions are very consistent with the types of actions that are ongoing now. You could remove sediment through dredging. You could cap it, which means you put clean fill material to prevent the contaminated material from being transported anywhere. You can pump and treat groundwater to extract contaminants. And then the third option is resource and resource use-based restoration, which means implementing projects specifically focused on generating additional ecological, recreational, and groundwater benefits. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the resource-based option. Okay, so alternative C. So under the resource and resource use-based restoration alternative, there are 3 types of projects. Under ecological, the ecological projects are listed here because they focus on ecological, and the design is mainly meant towards benefiting ecological resources. However, these projects can also be designed in order to benefit groundwater and recreation as well. So these are siloed for explanation, but not necessarily to prevent benefits from being available across each of these components. There are a few ways that the trustees identified that you could benefit the ecosystem through restoration actions. One is to create habitat, and that means taking an area that is disturbed or that is paved or that is something that is very degraded, and you actually implement actions to create some type of habitat in that space. You can restore or enhance existing habitat. That means thinking about the existing habitat and identifying one or more components of that habitat that you can improve. So for example, you have some wetland, but it's dominated by invasive species. You can remove those invasive species, plant native plants. You still have a wetland, but now the quality is much greater. Or you can preserve habitat. So for example, you could acquire a piece of property that is, has some benefit to ecological resources, and you could preserve it either through acquisition or a conservation easement or some other mechanism. We are aware that ecological projects may not generate enough benefit to groundwater, and so there are a suite of groundwater restoration project categories that could be implemented. Examples the focus is to improve groundwater recharge and groundwater quality. So some examples are green parking lots, green streets, rain gardens, septic conversions to prevent sewage from getting into stormwater, and then also capping abandoned wells, for example, in areas where surface water might be contaminated, and then it might run into the abandoned groundwater well, and then it would contaminate the underlying groundwater. And then finally, recreation. We want to make sure that even through all those other projects I described, there is sufficient benefit for the public to be able to use and access recreational resources. So some of these opportunities include improving access, improving amenities, improving infrastructure like restrooms, boat launches, et cetera. We could also preserve property or acquire property that would allow the public to have additional access to a recreational resource. And it also means improving or increasing opportunities for recreation on existing properties like hiking or biking, et cetera. So how do we pick? It seems a little set up, like we should probably pick alternative C, but we need to figure out and undertake a reasonable process that's transparent, that's consistent, that justifies the selection of whichever alternative the trustees identify. So there are a few pieces of information that we look at in order to determine which alternative is the most appropriate. One is a suite of site-specific criteria that the trustees as a group all identified as priorities. So for example, if we're going to implement restoration, it should be within a priority area. And the map I'm showing you here is the priority area that the trustees have defined. The yellow is sort of priority area number 1. It includes Oak Ridge Reservation, the stretch of the Clinch River, and some of the pieces of the watershed that are adjacent to impacted areas. And then the green are some watersheds that are just sort of one step out from that. It's desired that the restoration provide long-term sustainable benefits and account for climate change, increase habitat connectivity, increase water quality, provide benefits to listed species. A listed species is a species that has been identified by federal agencies or state agencies that is at risk because of habitat degradation or climate change or something, but that needs a particular, some particular assistance. And then also, as I mentioned, to improve the public's access to and quality of recreational resources. In addition to site-specific criteria, the regulations identify 10 additional considerations that the trustees need to review. I've just listed 2 of them here. One is cost effectiveness and the other is technical feasibility. But other types of requirements include concerns for public health and safety. Is something being done, will an action counteract any other action that's already being required as part of another process? And then because one regulation isn't enough, there is another federal regulation that needs to be evaluated. One, it's called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and it specifically requires federal agencies to evaluate the impact of their proposed actions. And that's because it might seem like a great idea to put a wetland over here, but if in putting the wetland over here, you're disturbing some critical habitat for a listed bug, then you're not actually doing something that is ultimately beneficial. So we look at the severity of the impact, the duration of impact, the types of impacts. What is this project going to do to the public and also to the environment? And then the last thing is, are these projects going to provide, is this project under this alternative going to provide compensation for losses? That's the whole point of this process, is the public getting something out of this process that will compensate for all of the injuries that I've described? Okay. So 3 alternatives on the left, right? A is no action, B is contaminant removal, and C is the resource and resource use-based restoration. And then you can see across the top there's site-specific criteria, the CERCLA, the regulatory criteria, whether or not the alternative will benefit the public and provide compensation, and then the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act that I mentioned, that is covered under the cumulative impacts. So cumulative impacts is exactly what the words describe, which is if you have, for example, I'll go back to my wetland example. You are going to construct a wetland. In the short term, you might actually be doing a little bit of harm because you're digging stuff up or you're releasing airborne particles as part of your action. But you need to contrast that with the long-term benefit of ultimately having this wetland. So we look at the cumulative impacts of each action. And you can see that the no action alternative does not score very well. It doesn't satisfy any of the criteria. Most importantly, it does not actually provide the public with any compensation. And that means ultimately the cumulative impacts of choosing that action are adverse because there's no restoration that happens. And it means that it will take longer for resources to reach their baseline condition. Alternative B, contaminant removal, it meets some of the site-specific criteria. For example, you could do contaminant removal in the Oak Ridge Reservation. That checks off the box of it's in our priority restoration area. If you implement contaminant removal, you will likely improve water quality. Also checks another box. but it does not meet all of the criteria. It's not going to increase habitat connectivity, it's unlikely to benefit listed species, et cetera. It does meet most of the CERCLA criteria, which, as I said, are cost effectiveness, technical feasibility. Those remedial type actions I described have been implemented not just at Oak Ridge, but at many other places. We know they can be done, and we know they can be ultimately successful. But the big detractor from option B is that it doesn't compensate the public. Once again, you are removing contamination, which is reducing future injury, and that is certainly a benefit. But you are not compensating for all of the interim losses, all of the time when those resources were injured, right? All the time you had to walk to work because your car was in the shop. And we believe that the cumulative impacts of implementing projects under Alternative B, they would be ultimately beneficial. The last option, Alternative C, which is our resource and resource use-based restoration, does satisfy all of the conditions that we've identified. So it meets all of the site-specific criteria, all of the CERCLA criteria. It will compensate the public by implementing restoration that creates additional resource benefits and resource services, and the cumulative impacts will be beneficial. What we are doing here today is part of a comprehensive public process. So all of the information I just discussed is presented in the draft RCDP-EA, which Ben mentioned I think is available out front. It's also available online and through the Department of Energy Information Center. The public is invited to review and comment. The comment period began August 15th and runs through September 28th. And in addition, as Ben mentioned, comments and questions will be accepted during this meeting. So that is all I have to say as part of the formal slide presentation. I'm going to turn it over to John. Thanks.